June 4th, 1943, Mexia, Texas. The pencil in Una Fritzia Vera Burkhardt's hand quivered as the train lurched to a stop. Hidden in the folds of his jacket, his small diary absorbed the words he dared not speak aloud, words that could have landed him in solitary if his officers ever found them. "The Americans must be deceiving us," he scrawled. "No country could live like this while waging war on two fronts." Outside his window, Texas shimmered with light, a sea of electricity stretching endlessly over the plains. Every farmhouse glowed, every storefront blazed, every street lamp burned bright at 10 o'clock at night. For 3 years, German propaganda had painted America as a collapsing, decadent nation, yet what Burkhardt saw contradicted everything he'd been told. In Germany, since 1940, blackout curtains had smothered the nights in silence and fear. Even before the war, barely 1 in 5 farms had power. But here, in a land the Reich mocked as soft and divided, electricity ran as freely as rainwater. When the doors opened, 1,850 men of Rommel's Africa Corps stepped onto the platform, not from grimy cattle cars, but from cushioned Pullman coaches complete with bunks and dining cars. The townspeople of Mexia lined the tracks to witness the moment. The arrival of their enemies, now captives, stepping into a world that would quietly dismantle the very ideology they'd been taught to die for. None of the Germans could yet grasp it, but the real weapon of America wasn't its guns or tanks. It was the sheer, unstoppable machinery of industry, a force that would rewrite the mathematics of victory and crumble the myths of Nazi superiority, one astonished mind at a time. The unraveling began far from Texas, beneath the blinding sun of Tunisia. On May 13, 1943, the desert finally swallowed what was left of Hitler's dream of empire in Africa. General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's successor, surrendered alongside 250,000 Axis troops, the last remnant of the famed Africa Corps. The numbers staggered even Allied commanders. Between 250,000 and 275,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms. It was one of the largest capitulations in military history. Among those taken prisoner was Hauptmann Friedrich Radke, a decorated officer wearing the Iron Cross First Class, a man who had fought through France, bled twice in the desert, and still believed in the invincibility of the Reich. Years later, his diary, found in the U.S. National Archives, would reveal what it felt like to watch that invincibility disintegrate, not just on the battlefield, but in the mind. His words trace the quiet evolution from arrogance to astonishment, from loyalty to doubt, as captivity forced him to confront a version of America that propaganda had taught him could not exist. The long journey from defeat to revelation began at the port of Oran, Algeria, where tens of thousands of weary prisoners waited under the sun for transport ships. It was there, before a single foot had touched American soil, that the first cracks appeared in their certainty. At the port of Oran, the defeated soldiers of the Africa Corps expected humiliation, the chaos, filth, and indifference that usually greet captives. Instead, they found precision. Each man was registered, photographed, examined, and inoculated in a process so efficient it seemed almost mechanical. The Americans moved thousands through the system daily with a calm discipline that many Germans quietly admitted surpassed the Wehrmacht's own. Orders were given in fluent German by officers trained specifically to handle prisoners of war. Even their rights under the Geneva Convention were explained clearly, something unheard of in the Axis camps. The first real shock, however, came not from paperwork, but from food. Oberrichter Hans Müller, once of the 21st Panzer Division, would later write to his mother, "At Oran they fed us better in a single day than we had eaten in 6 months of desert fighting white bread instead of black crusts. Real coffee, not roasted barley. Meat served twice a day." Most of the prisoners assumed it was a psychological tactic, an attempt to impress them before harsher treatment followed. Only later would they learn the truth. This was simply the standard U.S. Army ration. Even the ships that would carry them across the Atlantic were revelations in steel and speed. The Liberty ships, unremarkable in design but staggering in scale, embodied the secret of American power, production without limit. One of them, the SS Robert E. Peary, had been built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at Kaiser shipyards in California. To German eyes, such a feat would have seemed absurd, impossible, a propaganda fantasy, but it was real. At the height of the war, American shipyards produced 3 of these giants every day, and by mid-1943 they were hauling not only supplies to Europe, but also 30,000 prisoners a month on their return voyages. The same vessels that fed and armed the Allies now carried the defeated across the ocean, into a world that would quietly dismantle everything they thought they knew about power, progress, and civilization. The voyage to America became a lesson in disbelief. For 2 weeks, the Liberty ships plowed westward through the Atlantic, their gray hulls groaning under the weight of captured soldiers who had once marched through North Africa with the arrogance of conquerors. Now, confined to their bunks or standing on deck beneath the open sky, they began to see the first evidence that the world they'd been told about was a lie. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept a meticulous record in letters that would one day survive him. He wrote of sailors tossing away half-eaten steaks, loaves of white bread, and bottles of milk that had gone just slightly sour. They threw it away without a second thought, he noted, not to mock us, simply because it meant nothing to them. They had more. The waste was staggering, but it wasn't cruelty. It was indifference born of plenty, a kind of abundance the Germans could not comprehend. Talkative American guards, proud of their country's industry, explained that each Liberty ship was only one among 2,710 built during the war. Each required 250,000 separate parts manufactured across 32 states, then assembled in ports that had barely existed before 1941. To the Germans, who came from a nation obsessed with efficiency and control, it was dizzying. The Americans didn't just match their production, they outproduced their imagination. One prisoner, Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Staubner, a Prussian officer from a line of soldiers stretching back to Frederick the Great, stood on deck as they neared the coast. Watching the radar antenna sweep silently above the bridge, he felt something tighten in his chest. Radar, a technology his engineers had claimed was secret, rare, and precious, turning lazily on a cargo ship. In that moment, he later wrote, I understood that the war was already lost. When the first gray outline of land rose on the horizon, the prisoners crowded the rails in silence. By the time the Liberty ship glided into Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia, the sheer scale of America's war machine was undeniable. Stretching over 4,300 acres, Norfolk was less a port than a living organism of steel and motion. Cranes the size of church towers swung back and forth across endless piers. Convoys of trucks rumbled beneath gantries that loaded and unloaded ships with mechanical rhythm. In a single day, the port handled more tonnage than Hamburg managed in an entire week. Gefreiter Johann Weber, who had worked in a Ruhr factory before conscription, counted 47 cargo ships in various stages of unloading. He watched as electric cranes lifted entire rail cars worth of cargo with effortless precision, machines replacing the dozens of men and horses still used in Germany. There was no smoke, no shouting, no chaos, only the quiet hum of electricity. As they disembarked, the prisoners were organized into columns and marched toward waiting trains. On either side of the road stretched parking lots glinting with automobiles. Not military vehicles, civilian cars, hundreds of them. The guards explained that they belonged to the dock workers. The men stared in disbelief. In Germany, a private car was a symbol of status, a reward reserved for party elites or officers. The Volkswagen, once promised to every loyal German family, had remained a phantom dream, fewer than 1,000 ever reaching civilians. Yet here, ordinary laborers drove to work. But the true astonishment came when they saw the trains. Not freight wagons, not boxcars, or the cramped 40 and 8 transports that had carried German soldiers across Europe, but gleaming Pullman coaches with padded seats, sleeping berths, and dining cars draped in white linens and polished silver. Hauptmann Radke wrote later, "We boarded as though we were tourists, not prisoners." An American sergeant even apologized that the air conditioning in one of the cars wasn't functioning properly. For the men who had spent weeks baking in desert heat or freezing in bombed-out barracks, the concept of air-conditioned transport felt like science fiction. The 3-day rail journey to Texas was about to begin, and with it, the slow, irreversible collapse of everything they thought they knew about their enemies, their country, and themselves. The journey from Virginia to Texas unfolded like a moving classroom in disbelief. Pressed against the windows, the German prisoners watched a world that, according to every Nazi broadcast, wasn't supposed to exist. As the train rolled through Virginia, they passed small towns that glowed like constellations. Street lamps lined the roads. Shop windows burned with electric signs long past midnight. Houses shimmered with light in multiple rooms. An extravagance unimaginable in Germany, where darkness had become a patriotic duty since 1940. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, whose father had been a Nazi party block leader in Hamburg, would later confess, "Every American town we saw had more electricity than all of Hamburg. When I told the guards this was impossible, they just smiled and said we'd see more." At a stop in Roanoke, the prisoners watched American railway workers refuel and service the locomotives. What took 2 hours in Germany was finished in half an hour. Coal was poured by automated loaders, water pumped by electric motors, wheels greased by mechanized systems. The POWs stood silent as they observed the workers themselves. Men wearing brand new leather boots, drinking Coca-Cola from glass bottles, smoking cigarettes that they discarded half-finished. Their apparent wastefulness stunned the soldiers. These men lived better than many German officers. Feldwebel Hinrich Müller, an electrical engineer before the war, did the math. The railway yard's electricity consumption in a single hour, he calculated, exceeded what his entire Berlin district used in a day. Their waste, he wrote, was magnificent, the carelessness of a nation that could never run out. As the trains pushed into Tennessee and Kentucky, America's industrial heart began to reveal itself. Factories stretched for miles along the tracks, glowing windows, conveyor belts in motion, parking lots full even at midnight. Near Alcoa, Tennessee, the prisoners saw an aluminum plant 3 miles long, its furnaces devouring 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich. Later, passing Louisville, they glimpsed the Rubbertown complex, a cluster of synthetic rubber plants built in only 18 months. 4 enormous facilities, each employing thousands, producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually, 6 times Germany's best yearly output, despite Germany having invented the process. One chemist among the prisoners, Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann of IG Farben, stared through the window and murmured to himself, "I know these machines, distillation towers, catalytic crackers. Each plant is beyond anything we ever built. And there are 4 here. They say dozens more across the country." By the time the train reached Detroit, the men were silent. Outside, they saw the colossal Willow Run plant, Ford's 2.5 million square foot factory, producing a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Lieutenant Hartmann Wehrle, a downed Luftwaffe pilot, pressed his face to the glass, watching assembly lines crawl with workers and machines. "They told us American planes were inferior, cheaply built," he wrote later, "but I saw their precision. I saw 17 bombers under construction at once. If this is inferiority, then we have already lost." As the trains crossed the Mississippi at St. Louis, the prisoners looked down from the Eads Bridge to see barges stacked with grain, more food floating beneath them than Germany had harvested in 1942. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, a Bavarian farmer's son, filled a diary page with disbelief. They move wheat as we move ammunition, endlessly, without concern for loss. One barge held enough to feed my village for 5 years. The crane operator ate a sandwich thicker than my ration book. By the time the trains reached Kansas City, the air smelled of meatpacking plants, thick and rich. Prisoners who had lived on scraps in Africa watched American workers eating beef sandwiches on their breaks. Gefreiter Paul Fisher wrote simply, "They eat meat as we eat bread. No, as we wish we could eat bread." That night, a guard bought a round of hamburgers from a station stand, 15 sandwiches for 20 men, paid for with a single dollar. It was the first taste of America most of them would ever have, and the beginning of a quiet, irreversible understanding. The Reich had sent them to conquer a nation whose power they had never truly imagined. As the trains thundered deeper into the heart of the continent, the prisoners began to grasp the scale of what they were seeing. America didn't merely possess industry, it was industry woven into its soil, humming through its towns, blazing from its skylines. The rail cars passed through a world that seemed almost mythic in its abundance. In Tennessee, the men stared at the endless expanse of the Alcoa plant. Furnaces roaring day and night, rivers of molten aluminum spilling from crucibles the size of tanks. The energy it consumed each hour surpassed what an entire German city required in a day. Near Louisville, the rubber town complex loomed, 4 vast synthetic rubber factories built from nothing in a year and a half. Steam hissed from stacks, conveyors rattled without pause, and the gods mentioned that together the plants produced 800,000 tons of rubber each year, 6 times the output of Germany's best efforts. For Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, the chemist from IG Farben, the sight was almost painful. He could identify every piece of equipment, distillation columns, catalytic converters, cracking towers. Yet their sheer number and scale made them alien. Each plant, he later wrote, was more advanced than anything we had ever built. And they said there were dozens more. When the trains neared Detroit, the landscape shifted again, from industrial might to mechanical perfection. Across the horizon stretched the Willow Run bomber plant, the brainchild of Henry Ford, rising from the earth like a city of metal. In only 9 months, the Americans had built a factory large enough to produce a B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. Inside, 42,000 workers assembled over 1.5 million parts, many shipped from 1,500 subcontractors. The plant drew more electricity than the entire city of Cologne. Watching from the train, Hauptmann Wehrli, a captured Luftwaffe pilot, saw 17 bombers in various stages of completion. "We were told their planes were cheap and fragile," he wrote later, "but I could see the precision in their work." They weren't weak, they were endless. By the time the train crossed the Mississippi River into the Midwest, the men had stopped speaking. Outside their windows, America unfolded as a nation of machinery, food, and light, the living antithesis of everything Nazi propaganda had promised. In Kansas City, they saw the stockyards, an empire of cattle stretching farther than the eye could see. The air smelled of meat, rich and heavy, the scent of plenty. Workers ate beef sandwiches during their breaks while laughing and sharing cigarettes. Gefreiter Paul Fisher, watching from the train window, could only shake his head. "They eat meat as we eat bread," he wrote. "No, they eat meat as we wish we could eat bread." At a small station along the route, an American guard bought hamburgers from a stand. Meat, cheese, vegetables stacked high on white bread. He paid for 20 sandwiches with a single dollar bill, a gesture so casual that it struck the prisoners harder than any propaganda film could have. This was no orchestrated display. It was ordinary life, and that ordinariness was what made it devastating. When the trains finally slowed on the outskirts of Texas, the men expected fences and hardship. What they found instead was something that defied everything they had been told about captivity.
The Camp Hearne prisoner of war facility stretched across the plains like a small organized town. Rows of wooden barracks stood neatly spaced, framed by cotton fields and mesquite trees. Watchtowers rose in the distance, but there were only a few guards visible, and even they seemed more relaxed than alert. The prisoners stepped off the train and squinted in the sunlight. They had braced themselves for hostility, but what greeted them was the smell of coffee, bread, and something sweet baking in the mess hall. Inside the camp, they discovered libraries, classrooms, and workshops. There were soccer fields and a small theater. One building even had a stage with curtains, built by the prisoners themselves, with tools provided by the Americans. For men who had been indoctrinated to believe that Allied soldiers were brutal, the experience was almost disorienting. They were given 3 meals a day, often the same rations as U.S. troops: eggs, fruit, meat, coffee, and milk. Gefreiter Otto Lang, a mechanic from Bremen, recorded in his diary, "I thought they would starve us. Instead, I am gaining weight. I sleep on a clean mattress. We have books in German. I feel guilty for how comfortable I am." The camp's rules were firm but fair. Prisoners worked, but mostly in agricultural or maintenance jobs, repairing roads, harvesting crops, or tending cattle for nearby farms. They were paid 80 cents a day, a portion of which could be spent at the camp canteen on cigarettes, chocolate, or postcards home. Some prisoners of war even began learning English, taught by volunteer American teachers or other prisoners fluent in the language. The classes became so popular that they expanded into subjects like mathematics, literature, and engineering. Lieutenant Franz Keller, once an ardent Nazi, found his worldview shifting in ways he couldn't ignore. He wrote, "They treat us as men, not as enemies." The propaganda told us Americans were decadent, lazy, and cruel, but they are efficient and strangely kind. I no longer know which side of this war is truly civilized. Outside the fences, local farmers soon began to notice the same thing. Many German prisoners worked alongside Americans in the fields, earning quiet respect for their discipline and skill. Some families invited them for meals after the harvest. Others exchanged letters long after the war ended. Inside the camp, the prisoners began to talk less about Germany's glory and more about what they would do when they returned home. The idea of rebuilding started to mean something different, not a rebirth of empire, but of humanity. By Christmas, they had formed choirs, built a church from scrap lumber, and staged plays about ordinary life. The stage curtain, stitched from potato sacks and dyed with coffee, became a symbol of something profound, that even in captivity they had discovered a version of freedom they'd never known in the Reich. It happened one night in the autumn of 1943. The heat of the day had faded, and the air over central Texas shimmered with the last breath of summer. The German prisoners were returning to camp after a long day of field work, their trucks rumbling down a dusty road that stretched toward the horizon. As the convoy crested a low hill, someone in the back called out. The engines quieted, and for a moment the only sound was the wind. Then the men saw it, a distant glow blooming on the horizon, spreading wider, brighter, until it seemed the sky itself had caught fire. At first they thought it must be a city ablaze, perhaps a disaster, a factory burning. But the guards smiled and told them otherwise. "It's just Dallas," one said, "and that smaller glow, that's Fort Worth." The prisoners stared in silence. They had never seen anything like it. The two cities, nearly 30 miles apart, merged into a single ocean of light, electric brilliance stretching farther than any bombed-out skyline of Europe could imagine. For men raised under blackout curtains and rationed power, it was as if the heavens had opened. Obergefreiter Karl Meissner later wrote, "In Germany, we were told America was struggling, a land of poverty and chaos. But standing on that hill, I saw more light than all of Berlin. more light than our entire country could have produced. One officer murmured that such waste of electricity was impossible, that no nation could afford to burn so much power for beauty alone. The guard just shrugged. "Those aren't factories," he said. "Those are homes." Homes. The word landed harder than any weapon. It wasn't just the brightness of America that shattered them. It was what the light represented: comfort without fear, abundance without cruelty, power without tyranny. For the first time, many of them realized the truth that no propaganda could erase, that they had been sent to destroy a country that, in its ordinary prosperity, had already outshone their empire's grandest dream. In that moment, the war was lost, not by force of arms, but by the quiet power of what the prisoners saw and could never unsee. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, who had written so many letters during his captivity, ended his last entry with a single line: "I did not know what freedom looked like until I saw it glowing on the horizon." By early 1944, the transformation was undeniable. The American officers who managed the POW program noticed it first: the silence during roll call, the change in posture, the sudden disappearance of defiant salutes. The swastika banners that once hung secretly in barracks were quietly burned. The loudest party loyalists, the true believers, found themselves isolated, no longer feared or followed. Something had broken inside the German ranks. Not their discipline, not their loyalty to comrades, but their belief in the world they had been promised. At Camp Hearne, an American interpreter named Major Paul Neeland described it best: "We did not need to lecture them. The facts of America lectured them every day. They saw democracy not as propaganda, but as practice: electric lights, full stomachs, freedom of speech, and dignity, even for prisoners." By the end of 1944, the U.S. Army's psychological reports began using a new term: the ideological demobilization of the Wehrmacht. It meant that thousands of soldiers had stopped believing. When repatriation finally came in 1946, many of those men returned to a Germany in ruins, its cities shattered, its people starving. But among them were thousands who carried something new, not resentment, but understanding. In their diaries and letters, historians later found an almost uniform reflection. "We entered captivity as soldiers of the Reich," wrote Lieutenant Friedrich Radke, "and we left as witnesses to another civilization. Some of them would become teachers, engineers, or local officials in the new West Germany. Many quietly helped rebuild a nation on the principles of freedom and efficiency they had once fought against. Others never spoke of what they saw, but all of them, in some corner of memory, carried the image of that Texas night, a world illuminated not by conquest, but by electricity, abundance, and quiet power." The true weapon of American victory had not been the bomb, the tank, or the rifle. It was the factory light, the assembly line, the hum of civilization running at full strength, proof that democracy could outproduce tyranny. And in the hearts of those who had once marched for Hitler, it lit something that even war could not extinguish: the dawning awareness of freedom.